Hello, friends. I met with a fellow today in a long-term care facility. He had an interesting story. He told me that about 6 months ago he was living homeless on the street, and as he was walking down the street, suddenly he lost consciousness and fell upon the sidewalk. He doesn't remember the fall, but he does remember waking up in an ambulance because it turned out he had broken his nose and hit his head pretty hard. Somebody had called the ambulance, and he woke up when they were taking him to the hospital. After being checked out, he was released, and a few weeks later, about a month later, he was again walking on the street when suddenly he fell, and again, not only hit his head, but twisted his neck, so much so that he had to wear a brace for over a month because of the injuries to his neck. When he had talked to him, he said, "I'm totally afraid of standing up again. I'm afraid that I'll pass out again, that I'll just suddenly fall." He said he was so afraid that he couldn't sleep at night because he was worried about falling. He says, "I'm in torture because it seems like fear has grabbed my head." And when I explored with him his beliefs about God and faith, he says, "Oh yeah, I believe in God. But I've been praying to God and asking God and supplicating to God. I've been reading the Bible and doing everything that the Bible tells me to do to release myself from this fear, but nothing seems to work." And then he asked me this question. He says, "What does God want from me? What do I need to do in order for God to help me to get out of this situation?" And that is a question that I think all of us ask ourselves at some point or another. We have a situation in which we've been working on, and we just seem to work on it and pray and affirm and know, and apparently nothing seems to happen. So in answer to his question, I remembered a story from the life of Jesus. I'd like to read it for you now. This is a story from the book of Mark. It's chapter 1, verses 21 to 28. And it says, "They went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, he entered the synagogue and taught. And they were astonished at his teachings, for he taught them as one having authority, not as the scribes. Just then there was in their midst in the synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, 'What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God.' But Jesus rebuked him, saying, 'Be silent and come out of him.' And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying with a loud voice, came out of him. And they were amazed, and they kept on asking one another, 'What is this? A new teaching with authority? He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him.'" The story seems to show us a Jesus who is demonstrating a great deal of authority in the way in which he addresses the issues of life. And it strikes me that maybe this is the answer to the question that the man was asking today. In the story, we have Jesus coming to an awareness that he wasn't beseeching, he wasn't asking, he wasn't pleading, he wasn't even affirming. He was speaking with authority. And it was that authority that cast out the demon, and it was that authority that allowed him to continue to do the miracles that we see in the Bible. So maybe here we have a key to the answer to this man's question, and maybe the question within our own heart. What is this authority? The dictionary tells us that authority is to be sure about something because of our knowing or our experience, implying that we have a certain knowing about something, we can speak with authority about that, or we have had an experience that have proven this to us, and so that also gives us a sense of knowing. But it strikes me that between those two ideas we might have a process that could help us come into this sense of authority. How do we capture that authority in our own relationship with God? Come to speak from that very knowing within us. Well, perhaps we can begin with our experience. And this is what I asked the man. I said, Do you remember a time in which God has seemed to have showed up in your life? Have you witnessed something wonderful? And he says, boy, I don't have to think too far back, because these two falls are to me an example of God's presence. You know, I fell both times. I lost consciousness. I don't remember falling. I don't remember the pain of hitting my head in the sidewalk. But you know what's incredible is I didn't break any bones. When I twisted my neck when I fell the second time, I could have ended up as a paralytic or even dead. And yet both times I was saved. I think those are miracles. And so I said to him, do you remember the feeling that you had when you realized that you had fallen and yet you hadn't really hurt yourself in such a way that was terribly traumatic for you? He says, oh yeah, I felt grateful. I felt protected by God. And even more than that, I felt like God had a plan for me, that he had saved me for a reason. I said, what does that feel like? And he described a feeling of trust, of protection, of knowing God's presence. I said, how about if we use that feeling to inform our faith and come into a knowing of God's presence, not in the moment of the fall, but in the situation that you find yourself in? You say that you feel fear has trapped your mind. Why don't we use this knowing to cast the demon of fear out of your mind? He says, well, what do you mean? I said, well, let's do this experience, and this is what I ask of you. Do you remember a time that God has showed up for you? That God has shown you favor? There's been grace. There's been an unexpected recovery, a healing, some synchronicity of events, some opening, some magical thing that has no other explanation but that the hand of God was at work in your life. And if you can remember that, I know all of us can. There are small things and there are large things, but if we can remember that and come into the feeling of it, that's the experience of the presence of God. Let's allow that experience now to inform our knowing. Not our belief, not our faith, not our hope, but our knowing. Let's work on that. Let our experience inform our knowing so that the knowing becomes anchored within us. Something solid, something that we call upon, and something that we can speak from. So there in that room today, I said, let's do that. And we got into the feeling of it. And I said, now, after he felt that he had some sense of knowing, I said, let us imagine that fear that you've been talking about. Imagine it, if you like, as like a monster or some kind of being or some kind of creature. Maybe it's big, maybe it's small, you can see it. And I want you to direct your energy toward it. And I want you to speak these words from your knowing with authority. Fear, you have no power over me. You have no power over me. I want you to speak it from that deep sense of knowing. You have no power over me. And when you speak those words towards your fear, towards your worry, towards your impatience, towards your frustration for not having had God resolve the issue that you've been praying so long about, we come into a different sense of what prayer is all about. It says in the Bible that Jesus cast out a demon. In the same way, we're taking the power away from fear. And we know that once we eliminate that fear, then we can come into the open field of affirmation, where he can begin to declare things like, I stand up tall and secure and balanced, and I walk proudly forward in my life, something like that. But he needs to address the fear. And so that's what he started doing. Now maybe we don't affirm it once and it's over. Maybe we have to work on it every day. In the morning, in the evening, maybe even every 5 minutes. We just need to remind ourselves, fear, you have no power over me. And remind yourself that what God has done, God can do. What God has done, how God has showed up, God will show up. What God has done, God can do. We affirm that. We work on that. We let it come from our knowing. We speak with authority. And we see the demon cast out of our mind. Thank you, God. This is Juan Enrique Toro reminding you that life is consciousness and consciousness is life.